Alrighty, this is take 2 of Observer because I messed it up last time. Embarrassing. So the Observer design pattern is just about sending and receiving events and subscribing to things so we can be notified when stuff happens. It's a very, very helpful pattern, especially in networked games, and allows us to communicate with other files without them necessarily knowing about our existence. It is a very useful design pattern. In fact, we have used it before. We used it when we set up the player controls, as these are all observers. Plus equals means we're subscribing to an event and searching for when it happens. We're going to add our first observer pattern today, but we're also going to do something that involves our singletons. Now, there are many, many ways to do things, and the first thing I want to show you is what we could do. It could be done with an observer, yes, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way or the fastest way. So let's say we want to check if the player is hit and we want to update the health when they are hit. What we can do is something like this. We can say public action, okay, and this one's actually going to be an event action. We're going to say on hit, okay, and then once we are hit, we need to bind it. So we're going to say on hit, bind ourselves to, and then we can access our singleton or other way around, and then we can say set health percent as our health divided by the max health. Or we can add it as a parameter. So we go over here and we just say float, and now we're going to pass it down. So over here I can say set health percent, and this will be a method group instead, because it knows implicitly that it needs a float. Now if you don't want it to be a method group, then you could say value like this. See, and now it knows it's a float, and then I can pass it down like this, value. We want it to be a method group though, and the reason we want that is so we can unsubscribe from the event. So I'm going to create the method, and you see it's a float. I spelled percent wrong, don't worry about it. And now over here, whenever you subscribe to something, you need to always unsubscribe from it. So generally when you're working with Observer, you actually create on enable and on disable. And in on enable, we bind, and in on disable, we unbind. That's the idea. Now the reason why we made this one an event is because that means it can't be invoked from other files. So for instance, in player controller, where it knows that a player exists, that means I can't ask it to do its action. I can't invoke it. But what I can still do is subscribe to it and ask it to do stuff. Okay. If I head back over to here, this will actually work at this point. And then we can just make an interface, which I've already done, called iDamageable. It's very, very handy. It allows us to make anything damageable easily, but just append it over here. iDamageable. When we take damage, implement our missing member, then we're going to invoke our health on hit, just like this, invoke it with our amount. Now we don't want to just say amount, but instead we'll say our health, which doesn't exist, divided by our max health. And we need to create those variables, of course. So we'll have our serialized field for our health, and we'll have a private float max health as well, of course. And I've actually made these backwards. This one should be serialized, this one shouldn't. And this one should get an underscore, and this one shouldn't. Great. And that would totally work. And it's not terrible to do it this way, and it might make sense. But for sake of health, this is actually not the best way to do it. Now, delegates are expensive to update. How do they work under the hood? We are storing a reference to an object forever, pretty much, and we need to be able to somehow tell it a message. It is a whole slew of black magic witchcraft. There's a reason why it's not the first thing you learn, and that's because computers, well, it's complicated, right? So is there a better way we can do this? Now, we're already using the singleton pattern to even get here in the first place, right? So let us remove this. And then instead, whenever our health is updated, let's instead create a public float health. And let's have a get and a set, just like this. When our health value is set, and let's make it private set, because no one else should have access to this, or protect it if that makes more sense. And let's add in our squiggle brackets so that way we can modify it. When we set our health value, let us also update our singleton in the exact same way. So I'm just going to, I deleted it because I'm silly. We're going to access our singleton to update our health percent to our health divided by our max health. And what we can also do while we're here is we can clamp it. So instead of just saying our health to our value, we can clamp the health to our value and a range between 0 and max health, preventing the health from ever being an illegal value. And now that we've done this, it's completely automated and we never have to think about it, as long as we're using the correct variable. Health minus amount. Done. That's it. Now, you don't have to make this public if you don't want to. You could make this private as well, and then you could keep this as private. And then everything is completely self-contained. And the advantage to this, again, is we don't have to use an action, which can be expensive, and it will work exactly the same. Okay, so that is how singleton can be powerful as well. But now you're like, okay, but then why would I ever want to use observer? Let's say something happens directly to you, or you don't necessarily have control of an action, or maybe it's just straight up a key pressed. Not everything can be solved with a singleton because you want to hide who is able to actually see what's happening. Like maybe we don't necessarily want everyone to know. Or like the receiver doesn't need to know about our existence, or we don't need to know about the receiver's existence for it to work. In the case of the mediator pattern, what we've done today makes perfect sense. But let's create an action. Let's say public action, and let's call it hit or attack. Maybe this would make more sense if we were doing like abilities and we wanted to keep track of whenever we, or maybe it's when you pick up an ability is a perfect instance of when you want to do this, because that is an action on ability pickup. It's not something that happens often, and we probably want to send that message out to a lot of things like a particle system and the UI and the player. They all need to be able to respond to that action that has happened, right? So we're not going to say event this time because we want to invoke it from another file. But let's say on attack because it's an action, and then in awake we can bind it to whatever events we need to bind it to, or we can do it elsewhere. And for instance, we can do it in here where we have a reference to player. Or we can even do it in attack component where we can get a player, get a reference to it, which would take this a little bit away from the mediator component, but we can say player.onAttack dot invoke. Or we can bind ourselves to it. So we can bind, and then we can say, which again, the way we're doing this right now is kind of illogical, but we can make an anonymous function that will just say print hello, or that is terrible. Why did I write that? We'll just print hello. Just a little anonymous function. We could also call a function instead, again, using method groups, and you generally want to use method groups because if the object is discarded, then you'll save that memory, but if it's not, then that memory will persist until the core is discarded. And then finally, what we need to do is we need to invoke it. So we can actually just say in here, which again does not really make much sense, but we can invoke it. So let's say invoke. And you'll see I did a question mark. This is a null assertion check. We're checking if onAttack exists. If it does, then we can invoke. That's the idea. And if it doesn't, then it won't. It won't give a null pointer exception. That is the idea behind the observer pattern. We can observe when events are happening. And sometimes you don't want to use the observer pattern. Sometimes there are creative ways around it. Especially when you're doing something a lot, observer pattern might not be the best option.